Welcome back, Social 30-1, Summer School 2021. And this is meant to give you a preview of the sources that you'll be challenged with on your political systems exam. So I'd like to give you a preview of the sources and kind of talk you through a little bit as to how the sources would be used on the exam without giving away too much. So for example, here you have four quotes, four arguments, if you will. And one of the general questions that we could ask here is to try to come up with a common theme. So this is what I would call a reading comprehension style question, where the work that you could do beforehand is just understanding the key terms and nuances of liberalism and non-liberalism as political systems. Connected to this topic might be ideas like plurality or identity or homogenization. We could also pull out one of the perspectives and ask about what would be the consequences if we ended up implementing that perspective. So if we take the first or second or third or fourth argument and implement it, what kind of change would we end up creating around the world? So two types of reading comprehension questions here. Again, how do you study for it? You'd study the language. Terms that could come up would be things like plurality, homogenization, collective versus individual identity, the idea of maybe imposing liberalism even, and the evolution of liberalism itself. Another reading comprehension attachment to this question could be, now that we are doing this, then we want you to critically think what would happen as a result. So some critical thinking attached to that question. Next up, we have a quote from former Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau, and often we'll have reading comprehension questions where we'll take something and say, taken in context, within the quote, when, in this case, Prime Minister Trudeau says this, then what is he referring to, or what might be the context of it? Another way to take something in context and ask you to internalize what is being said is, when he says something, what would be a good counter argument against his topic here? So what Trudeau was talking about is plurality and uniformity, and in essence what he's talking about is the idea that there isn't one Canadian but many. And you might be able to see in this some connections to some politicians that are expecting the opposite today. Under popularism, they expect more conformity, for example. So it's that idea of conformity versus uniqueness that's being unpacked here. Next up, we have a familiar contrast, and we might ask a question like, what's the primary message here as it relates to society? If somebody presents both of these together as a set, why might they do that? What's the objective of showing these two together? And connected to that might be concepts like, the branches of government and, what is the executive branch up to? Connected to it might be ideas like, state or civil law versus cultural expectations. So again, conservative versus liberal values and whether they can coexist. So it's not so much a question that you study before, but it's a question that you apply some understanding of ideas like liberal and conservative values, or adherence to collective norms, or law in the executive branch. You apply your understanding of those concepts to, in this case, a scenario as to why would somebody show these two pictures together. This next source, position 1, position 2, and a big question mark in the middle, is going to be testing a very similar skill that you would see on an A1. And it is basically part of that relationship part of A1 where we say, both positions identified are answering which common inquiry. What would be the question mark? What would be the question that holds them together? And central to this would be, understanding of ideas like tyranny and totalitarianism, ideas like inevitable forces within history, and maybe distinction between communism and fascism. Next up, we have a cartoon that we talked about in class, and often with cartoons and sources, we'll ask, what is the primary message here? What is the primary message in terms of the cartoonist saying with regards to liberalism? What are they saying about the evolution of liberalism? Or what are they saying about, in this case, the term objectionable? So how do you practice for this, or how do you prep for this? You might want to go back and remind yourself the word dissent, or the idea of Orwellian. You might want to go back and look at your notes about the nature of man, or even our conversation about the source itself and the idea of whitewashing history. Next up, we have a familiar quote from Hobbes, and we might ask you to take his ideas and apply it, right? An application style question. Apply his ideas to the contemporary world. Which of the following examples would be a modern Leviathan that maybe even a pro-democracy person would support? So we pull an idea out of the source, in this case Leviathan, and that's the jumping off point behind the question. So the source reminds you of the purpose of Leviathan, and then the question might be, what would a promoter of liberalism, like a pro-democracy person like Locke, what kind of Leviathan would they even be okay with? To try to find that common ground between collectivism and liberalism. Next up, a very short quote from Nietzsche, and again, we might ask you about which of the following scenarios provides an example of this theory in practice that both liberals and authoritarians would support. So this asks you to do some critical thinking and some synthetic thinking, right? You're going to analyze the idea of a source and synthesize some kind of response. And in the response, there may be references to case studies you're not aware of, but it's not so much the case study, it's the scenario. Does it fit with this idea? So you have to understand what this idea is referring to. Having the right enemy can be a powerful motivating force. And then come up with a scenario that, both dictatorships, people who support that, and people who support democracy would be okay with this example. Here we have a simple, how well do you know your terminology question. What word goes here? That short-term causes this, long-term causes that. And again, knowing your glossary, your key terms helps. Next up, we might give two quick quotes. And again, these quotes could be relatively new to you, but it's not that have you memorized the quote, it's can you relate the quote to something else? Which of the following statements is most directly supported by what we've said? So we're going to take two things, we're going to make some statements, and we're going to say, here's four options. Which of these four things down here matches up with this? So it is a matching comprehension question. Key to it would be understanding the words like techniques of dictatorship, illiberalism, non-liberalism, viability, and maybe some idea of regulation of things like the media. Next up, very predictably, we have the techniques of dictatorship. So you don't have to memorize them, right? They're already on the test for you. That's the point. You're not memorizing them, but rather than memorizing them, you're kind of matching them up. So, and because they're showing communism here, the Nazis, and fascism here, the Nazis, and communism here, and they should have done it left and right. They have the left and right spectrum mixed up, but they have the Nazis and communists. Because they're showing what happens under Nazis and communists, there might be an opportunity for you to compare and contrast those two ideologies here. Here's another source, and we might ask you to match what's happening here with the technique that's happening up here. So not only is it important to identify the techniques, but be able to picture the techniques. What would an illustration of that technique look like? Next up, we have some great quotes from authoritarians, and you might be wondering, well, how am I going to apply those on a test? Well, you have a 3-1 split here, 3 that are pro-authoritarian and 1 that's pro-democracy. So you might have a question like, supporters of Martin Luther King's opinion would respond to the others by doing what? How would a pro-democracy person respond to pro-authoritarian people? Here we have a contextual question. Why would the state in America be saying this to the people to watch your parents? The conditions, concerns, and values highlighted in this would be used to justify what ideology or what practice. So now we're taking language and saying, how much do we know about fascism or liberalism or illiberalism or communism, and which of those 4 ideologies or practices is being shown here? That is a straight vocabulary recall question. Next up, we have pieces of legislation, and we want you to understand how they connect. What do they have in common? Then we have, didn't need to tell you which question number that is from, but we have some sources here about the rise of communism in Russia and the transformation of Russia into the USSR. So we might argue that, what would a supporter of communism say? Or what would, conversely, an opponent of communism, how would they respond to the information being shown here? Again, application of knowledge. Now we have a quote from Trump and a quote from Colonel Gaddafi. You're not meant to have known these quotes. You're not meant to have memorized them. But the question might be, to a supporter of liberalism, what does this do? Does it frustrate you? Does it give you something that you approve of? Does it give you evidence that supports your position? Or does it give you an account that attacks your position? So we're going to give you a scenario, and you're going to need to say, due to a supporter or an opponent of liberalism, how would they respond to what's being said here? And again, that's that critical synthetic thinking. You have to analyze something, and you have to synthesize something new at the end. I love charts. I love graphs. Here's a map of the world, and it's showing you how free countries are. And then there's a related source from a anarchist. And basically, we're just trying to say, what is this showing? Can you read a graph? Can you read what the letters mean? What is this showing? And then based on the sentiment that Emma Goldman is saying here, how would she respond to what the graph? So that's that synthesis, right? Synthesizing, connecting two things. Here we have that chart that shows the rise and fall of apathy in elections in America with the related introduction of media. And we might ask you to do some kind of synthetic concluding observation. And then we might ask you to, based upon this source, how is Canada and the United States different? What difference between Canada and the United States' political systems is being highlighted there? Next up, we have a chart, and we might say, okay, here's the chart that says the pros and cons of something, but it's the pros and cons of what? Is this the pros and cons of bipartisanship? Is this the pros and cons of first past the post? Is this pros and cons of checks and balances? Is this the pros and cons of responsible government? So that's straight from chapter 10. That's straight from your glossary key terms, and no, you should not get that one wrong. Often with a cartoon, we'll say, what's the intent of this cartoon? Is it to suggest that there's something wrong with democracy or something right about authoritarianism? Is it something about adopting liberalism or challenging liberalism? Again, that's a skill that we use in A1, so you should have lots of practice with it. Here's that source that we knew was going to be on the test from HUAC, along with its related source as well. And we might say, a supporter of McCarthyism. What would they say about the driver's actions? A supporter of McCarthyism would suggest that the actions or the activities of the driver are justified or unjustified, reasonable or unconstitutional. How would a supporter of McCarthy? So to get this right, you need to know who McCarthy is and how is he connected to the Committee on Un-American Activities. If he's a big part of that committee, maybe he's the guy driving. If he challenges the committee, he's probably challenging what the guy driving is doing. To a critic of the actions of the government shown in 2, The most likely causal relationship between the government and the governed is that what? So first thing you need to do in this cartoon to understand a critic of the actions of the cartoon would be to say, okay, what's the actions of government in the cartoon doing? So there's some of that analyzing what's on the page. Next up, we have some connections to the media. And the media is looking at the watchdog didn't bark, right? The watchdog didn't bark. So the watchdog doesn't bark, and then they give you some information about a scenario. And the question might be logically, why didn't the dog bark? Why didn't that dog bark? So again, it's reading this, analyzing it, and trying to figure out why this guy didn't bark here. Freedom on the net in various countries and America's most trading partners. So this is an interesting combination of sources. You have this saying, this is how free countries are. Canada, very free. China, not so much, right? China is not free at all, really. And then this is who America trades with. America trades a lot more. They import more from China than even Canada. So even though China is a totalitarian, or not, it's an authoritarian state, they buy more stuff from China than they buy from here. So what kind of conclusion can we make about America and their foreign policy based upon that? Next up, we have some articles from, in this case, the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And then we have a cartoon, and we may ask you to try to connect the two. You know, this is an illustration of what up here? What is it showing us? This test wouldn't be complete without a section on our look at women's rights. So we're going to have some cartoons that look at women's rights. And logically, we'd ask you for the perspective of the cartoonist based upon how they illustrated the waves of feminism. But we also have that historical protest from 1917. And this contrast to the role of women's shown at that time as well. So we have a set of 4 questions here on the waves of feminism, and we could ask you to say which one is most or least supportive of women's rights based upon the content. What is a question, a common question that multiple sources are answering? What are these protesters attempting to do? And as a set, how does this one stand out? As a set, what's different about that one? Then we're going to have some election results because we did do some study about electoral systems. So we might ask questions like, based upon the percentage of people voted and the percentage of votes and percentage of seats, which party actually was most underrepresented? So here the Liberals had 39.5% of the vote and they got 54% of the seats. They're overrepresented, right? Overrepresented. The Bloc Québécois had 4.7% of the vote, 3% of the seats. They're underrepresented by 1.7%. So this is a simple math question. You take this number, you subtract that, and the party with the highest positive number is your answer. Going back to combining a little bit from our last unit to this unit, we're combining the idea of protest here a little bit. From the perspective of the government of Canada, why would it be acceptable for them to put that person in jail? It's a little throwback question for you. Now we have some questions based upon the post 9/11 world, and we have some familiar cartoons from, again, all the sources are straight out of the lessons, and we have some quotes here from Quebec as well. And we might ask you to look at them from the perspective of a supporter of authoritarianism, or the opposite, a supporter of civil libertarianism, where you want very little government, to find would the government actions above be acceptable or unacceptable, and why. What's the dilemma that the democracy is facing in this scenario? You know, what is the problem that they're facing? And then the last source on the test is this one, or this set, sorry. And what we're looking at here is, you know, the concept of, you know, populism and plurality, and yeah, a little bit attached to the idea of lobby groups and checks and balances here as well. So That's a preview of some of the sources that you'll see on Monday.